Have you ever heard of a war that technically ended more than 40 years ago, yet somehow never really ended at all? A place so remote, so windswept, that most of the world barely knows it exists, yet two nations were willing to send thousands of soldiers across oceans to fight, to kill, and to die for it? Welcome to World's Echoes, where we uncover the hidden battles of history, the mysteries that shaped our world, and the echoes they still leave behind today. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this one are just the beginning. The Falklands. Or, as Argentina calls them, the Malvinas. A cluster of cold, lonely islands in the South Atlantic, closer to Antarctica than to London, and yet they've become one of the most bitterly contested pieces of land in modern history. On the surface, they might seem insignificant: sparse sheep pastures, rocky coasts, a few small towns battered by constant winds. But beneath that surface lies a struggle over identity, power, and pride. And once, in 1982, that struggle erupted into open war. But here's the question: why? Why would Britain and Argentina, two countries separated by an entire ocean, spill blood over a scattering of islands that look, to most outsiders, like little more than rugged hills surrounded by endless waves? The answer is both simple and complicated. Simple, because the war was about sovereignty. Complicated, because sovereignty is never just about land. It's about people, history, and national pride, and pride can be far more dangerous than geography. To understand the Falklands conflict, we need to journey back in time. For centuries, the islands were passed between different powers: French, Spanish, British, like a piece on a chessboard. By the 19th century, Britain had established permanent control, planting its flag in the rocky soil and setting up small communities of settlers, mostly of British descent. They farmed sheep, built homes, and lived lives that felt more connected to London than to Buenos Aires. But in Argentina, a different story was told. To them, the Malvinas had always been part of their territory, unfairly taken away by colonial powers. And for generations, this claim simmered. In classrooms, children were taught the Malvinas were theirs. In politics, leaders used the issue as a rallying cry for unity. By the late 20th century, the situation was explosive. Argentina was ruled by a military dictatorship facing growing unrest, protests, and economic collapse. They needed a distraction, something to stir patriotic fever and silence dissent. And so, in April 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falklands. For Britain, this was a shock. The islands were over 8,000 miles away. Few in London had thought much about them. But suddenly, national pride was on the line. Margaret Thatcher, Britain's Prime Minister at the time, decided she couldn't let the invasion stand. Within days, she ordered a naval task force to set sail across the Atlantic, an extraordinary gamble. Could Britain really fight a war on the other side of the world? Many doubted it. But the gamble would define her leadership and reshape history. The war that followed lasted just 10 weeks, but it was brutal. Battles were fought on land, sea, and air. Ships were sunk, soldiers killed, and planes shot down in fiery dogfights. The cold waters of the South Atlantic became a graveyard for hundreds. The Argentinians fought with determination, believing the islands were theirs by right. The British fought with equal determination, believing they were defending their people and their territory. And in the end, Britain won. On June 14, 1982, Argentine forces surrendered, and the Union Jack once again flew over Stanley, the island's capital. But here's the strange part. Though the shooting stopped, the war never truly ended. The bitterness, the claims, the politics, those still echo today. Argentina continues to insist the Malvinas are theirs. Britain continues to fortify its hold, stationing troops, planes, and warships nearby. And the islanders themselves, many of whom trace their families back generations, overwhelmingly choose to remain British. It's a stalemate. One that has lasted for more than 40 years. So what makes this war hidden? Well, unlike the great global conflicts of the 20th century, the Falklands rarely appear in the headlines. They sit quietly, far from the centers of power, almost forgotten by the wider world. Yet beneath the quiet lies a story of pride, sacrifice, and unresolved history. A story that could, under the right circumstances, flare up again. Because while the islands may look peaceful, the politics surrounding them are anything but. Imagine standing on the windswept cliffs of East Falkland. The air stings your face, the sea crashes violently against black rocks, and seabirds circle overhead. To the untrained eye, it looks like just another lonely corner of the earth. But every gust of wind carries whispers of the past, the roar of jet fighters, the thunder of naval guns, the cries of soldiers charging through the cold. The land remembers. And the people do too. As we continue deeper into this story, we'll explore what really happened during those fateful weeks of 1982, the strategies, the human cost, and why the Falklands, seemingly so small, so remote, remain one of the most fiercely contested places on Earth. Because history here isn't frozen. It's alive, shaping decisions made in London and Buenos Aires even today. When news of the Argentine invasion reached London, disbelief quickly turned into determination. For many in Britain, the Falklands were a distant, almost forgotten colony, but suddenly they became the center of the nation's pride. Margaret Thatcher faced a choice that could define her entire career. She could negotiate, concede, and watch Britain's global influence crumble. Or she could fight. Against the odds, against geography, and against the skepticism of her own allies, she chose war. Within days, Britain assembled one of the largest naval task forces since World War II. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, supply ships, and submarines all were mobilized to cross nearly 8,000 miles of ocean. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. The Royal Navy hadn't fought a war like this in decades. The Argentine military was closer, better positioned, and determined to hold what they believed was rightfully theirs. No one could predict how this would end. The voyage itself became part of the legend. Picture it, a steel armada carving through rough Atlantic waves, gray ships lined with Harrier junk jets on their decks, crews tense with anticipation. For the sailors, it wasn't just about strategy, it was about survival. They were leaving behind families, heading into the unknown, toward an enemy who had already dug in. Each day, the cold winds grew sharper. Each day, the sense of history pressed heavier on their shoulders. The first blows came at sea. On May 2, 1982, the British nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror stalked and sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano. Over 300 Argentine sailors were lost in those freezing waters. For Argentina, it was a national tragedy. For Britain, it was a grim demonstration of power. And yet, just days later, Argentina struck back with deadly precision. Using French-made Exocet missiles, Argentine pilots launched attacks on British ships, sinking the destroyer HMS Sheffield. 20 sailors were killed. The sight of the burning warship stunned Britain. This wasn't going to be an easy fight. The South Atlantic turned into a deadly chessboard. Every move, every maneuver, carried the weight of human lives. Argentina's Air Force launched daring raids, flying low over the waves to evade radar, risking everything to strike the British fleet. Pilots flew with extraordinary courage, skimming the ocean at suicidal altitudes. Many never returned. But each successful strike brought devastation. The British ships Ardent, Antelope, and Coventry were all lost in fiery explosions. For the men aboard those vessels, survival was a matter of seconds. Imagine the chaos, alarms blaring, decks shuddering under impact, flames erupting, smoke filling narrow corridors. Sailors scrambling for lifeboats as the freezing sea swallowed steel. Heroes emerged in those moments, men who risked their lives to save comrades, pulling others from burning compartments, guiding lifeboats through oil-slicked waters. And yet, despite the heavy blows, the British fleet pressed on. The war was not just about ships and planes, it was about boots on the ground. And to reclaim the islands, Britain had to land troops. In late May, under cover of darkness, British forces launched amphibious landings at San Carlos Water. The operation was perilous. Argentine aircraft struck hard and often, turning the landing zone into what soldiers grimly called Bomb Alley. But against all odds, the troops got ashore. Cold, exhausted, burdened with heavy packs, they began the long, grueling march across the islands toward Stanley, the capital. This is where the war turned brutally human. The Falklands terrain is unforgiving, treeless, windswept, boggy. Soldiers trudged for miles in freezing rain, carrying not just weapons but the weight of fear. Nights were long, bitterly cold, with men huddled in foxholes, waiting for dawn and the next clash. For the young soldiers, many barely in their 20s, it was a crash course in the harshest realities of war. The battles that followed were small by global standards, but they were fierce. Goose Green, Mount Tumbledown, Wireless Ridge, names that mean little to outsiders, but for veterans, they mark moments of life and death. At Goose Green, British paratroopers faced well-dug Argentine forces. The fighting was brutal, close, and costly. Yet, after hours of relentless combat, the Argentinians surrendered. It was the first major British victory on land, a moment that shifted morale. As the troops advanced, they clashed repeatedly with Argentine defenders. The young conscripts of Argentina, many poorly trained, poorly supplied, and freezing, fought with bravery, but morale crumbled as the British pushed closer to Stanley. Some soldiers lacked proper boots, food, even shelter. Stories emerged of hunger and despair, of commanders struggling to keep discipline. And all the while, the British pressed forward with determination, step by step across the cold, wet ground. By June, the endgame had arrived. The battle for Stanley was looming. On the night of June 11, British forces launched coordinated assaults on the ring of mountains surrounding the capital. Mount Longdon, Mount Tumbledown, Wireless Ridge. These peaks became battlegrounds of fire and steel. Artillery thundered. Machine guns rattled. Soldiers crawled through mud, explosions lighting the night sky. It was close, desperate fighting, men charging uphill into withering fire, determined to break through. Casualties were heavy. Lives were shattered in those dark hours. But slowly, relentlessly, the British gained ground. Argentine defenders fell back. And finally, on June 14, 1982, Argentine commanders in Stanley surrendered. The war was over. The Union Jack was raised once again. The cost, though, was immense. Nearly 650 Argentine soldiers and sailors lost their lives. 255 British servicemen never returned home. Hundreds more were wounded. Families were left grieving on both sides of the ocean. For Britain, it was a hard-won victory, restoring national pride and securing Thatcher's political future. For Argentina, it was a devastating defeat that helped topple the military dictatorship. But the echoes of the conflict didn't fade. They lingered in the hearts of veterans, in the graves that dot the islands, in the bitterness that still runs deep between London and Buenos Aires. The Falklands had been reclaimed, but at a terrible price. And here's something to think about: if another dispute erupted today, with new technologies, new weapons, and the same deep emotions, how different might the outcome be? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the Falklands could ever see another war? Let me know in the comments. When the guns fell silent on June 14, 1982, the South Atlantic seemed to return to its natural state of endless winds and restless seas. But beneath the silence, the war had left scars on the land, on the people, and on the nations involved. For Britain, the victory was celebrated as a moment of resilience, proof that a fading empire still carried a sharp sword. For Argentina, it was a bitter humiliation, a defeat that toppled a regime and left generations grappling with unanswered questions. In the short term, the consequences were clear. Argentina's military dictatorship, which had ruled with fear and violence throughout the 1970s, collapsed within a year. The loss of the Malvinas, so heavily publicized at home, so emotionally tied to national identity, destroyed what little legitimacy the junta had left. Crowds that had once cheered the invasion turned against the generals. By 1983, Argentina returned to democracy. In a strange way, the war that was meant to strengthen a dictatorship ended up burying it. In Britain, the opposite happened. Margaret Thatcher, once deeply unpopular, saw her reputation transformed. The Iron Lady had stood firm, had refused to yield, and in doing so had given Britain a sense of pride many felt had been lost after years of economic decline. The Falklands victory secured her re-election in 1983 and cemented her place as one of Britain's most formidable leaders. Yet the price of that victory was written in stone, the rows of graves in windswept cemeteries, the families forever altered. For the Falkland Islanders themselves, the war was both terrifying and transformative. During the occupation, many lived under fear, uncertain of their future. But after the war, they emerged with a renewed sense of identity. Britain invested heavily in the islands, improving infrastructure, education, and defenses. In the decades that followed, the Falklands shifted from being a neglected outpost to a well-supported community. And in 2013, when the islanders were given the chance to vote on their future, the result was overwhelming. Nearly 99% chose to remain British. But the story didn't end there. Argentina never abandoned its claim. For Argentinians, the Malvinas are more than rocks in the ocean, they are a symbol of sovereignty, of a wound left unhealed. In schools across the country, children are still taught that the Malvinas belong to Argentina. Maps label the islands not as Falklands but as Islas Malvinas. The defeat of 1982 may have ended the fighting, but it did not end the conviction. This is where the conflict transforms into something deeper. It's no longer just about military strategy or land. It's about memory, identity, and politics. Argentina insists the islands were stolen, an artifact of colonial injustice. Britain insists that self-determination matters most, that the people who live there have spoken, and their voices cannot be ignored. Two narratives, each powerful in its own way, locked in an endless duel. Meanwhile, the islands themselves gained new significance. In the years after the war, rich fishing waters and potential oil reserves around the Falklands turned them from symbolic rocks into valuable territory. Suddenly, this wasn't just about national pride. It was about resources, wealth, and strategic power. Britain strengthened its garrison, building an airbase at Mount Pleasant capable of hosting modern fighter jets and heavy transport planes. Warships patrolled the seas. The message was clear: the Falklands would not be left undefended again. Yet tensions have flared more than once since 1982. In the 1990s, there were moments of cautious diplomacy, even cooperation on oil exploration. But by the 2000s, as Argentina's economy faltered and national politics shifted, the Malvinas issue returned with force. Presidents raised it in speeches at the United Nations. Protests erupted in Buenos Aires. The rhetoric sharpened, and once again, the islands became a political touchstone. For Britain, the stakes were equally high. To give up the Falklands would not just be a territorial loss, it would be a signal to the world that Britain could no longer protect its people. And after the sacrifices of 1982, no government in London could afford to appear weak. The defense of the islands became permanent policy, with billions spent maintaining a military presence in one of the most remote corners of the globe. But here's the haunting truth: although the guns are silent, the war never really ended. It shifted shape. From open battlefields to courtrooms, from trenches to diplomatic halls. A war of words, maps, speeches, and symbols. Every year on April 2nd, Argentina marks the anniversary of its invasion, honoring its fallen soldiers and reaffirming its claim. Every year, Britain quietly reinforces its commitment to the islanders' right to choose their destiny. The Falklands stand as a reminder of how geography and history can trap nations in disputes that refuse to die. They are small, remote, seemingly insignificant, and yet they embody the pride of two entire countries. Pride that refuses compromise. Pride that turns rocky hills into sacred ground. And the people who live there? They carry on with their lives, raising sheep, fishing the cold waters, teaching their children in schools decorated with Union Jacks. But always, in the background, there is awareness. The awareness that they live on an island where history still presses close, where every gust of wind seems to whisper stories of war, and where the world beyond never fully forgets them. Today, the Falklands, or the Malvinas, depending on whose map you're reading, remain quiet. The skies are clear, the winds whip across the hills, and sheep graze on the same pastures that saw soldiers march and fall. The capital, Stanley, is a small, colorful town where children walk to school, fishermen head out to sea, and life unfolds in the rhythm of an island community. To an outsider, it feels peaceful, almost timeless. But look closer, and you'll sense it, the weight of history pressing down, the knowledge that this is no ordinary corner of the world. Because the conflict never truly ended. Britain still maintains a strong military presence, with fast jets at Mount Pleasant Air Base, radar stations scanning the skies, and warships patrolling the waters. It is one of the most heavily defended places for its size anywhere on Earth. Argentina still raises the claim at every opportunity, reminding its people that the Malvinas are, in their words, Argentine by right. And the islanders themselves? They live in between, determined to remain British, yet knowing that their homeland is a stage for forces far bigger than themselves. This is the paradox of the Falklands. On one hand, they are small, remote, forgotten by much of the world. On the other, they are a flashpoint that could, in the wrong moment, reignite into conflict. Not because of what they physically offer, the oil, fish, and strategic location matter, but because of what they symbolize. Pride. Identity. The idea of a nation's dignity. And here's where the story feels almost haunting. Think of how many wars in history started not because of resources, but because of pride. Because one side could not back down without losing face. The Falklands are exactly that kind of place. Britain cannot walk away, not after the lives lost in 1982, not after decades of promises to the islanders. Argentina cannot let go, not after generations of teaching that the Malvinas are theirs, not after so much blood and memory are tied to them. Two nations, locked in a struggle with no easy resolution. The question is, what happens next? Some say the conflict will fade with time, that as generations pass, the emotional fire will cool. Others fear the opposite, that someday, in a moment of political crisis or economic despair, the islands could once again become a rallying cry for leaders desperate to unite their people. A spark that could set history in motion all over again. And in that possibility lies the hidden danger. Because the world of today is not the world of 1982. Modern weapons are faster, deadlier, and more precise. The skies above the South Atlantic could be filled with drones, missiles, and cyber warfare. A new war here would not look like the one we just traced. It would be shorter, sharper, and far more devastating. The islands that once echoed with the sounds of rifles and artillery might one day, if peace fails, hear the thunder of technologies the soldiers of 1982 could scarcely imagine. But perhaps there's another possibility. Perhaps the Falklands could become not a battlefield, but a bridge. A place where Britain and Argentina, instead of clashing, find ways to cooperate on fishing rights, on science, on protecting the unique environment of the South Atlantic. It would require something rare in politics: compromise, humility, and imagination. It would mean turning a page in history that has been left open for too long. Until then, the islands remain as they always have been, caught between two stories, two names, two nations. The Falklands. The Malvinas. A symbol of division, but also a reminder of resilience. For those who fought there, for those who died there, and for those who still live under the shadow of that war, the memory is not distant. It is alive, carried in families, in ceremonies, in the very soil of the islands themselves. If you were to stand today at the War Memorial in Stanley, overlooking the harbor, you would see rows of names etched into stone. Names of men who sailed across oceans, who marched across frozen fields, who never came home. You would feel the wind whip across your face, hear the gulls cry, and understand that history is not just words in a book. It is here, in the ground, in the air, in the silence that follows. The silence of a war that ended, and yet never ended. And that is why this story matters. Because the Falklands conflict is more than a chapter of history. It is a lesson. A lesson about pride, about identity, about how far nations will go to defend their honor. A lesson about how war doesn't just stop when treaties are signed or when flags are raised, it lingers, shaping generations long after the shooting stops. At World's Echoes, we believe these hidden stories are worth remembering. Because they show us not just where we've been, but where we might go. They remind us that even in the most remote corners of the planet, the echoes of history are never far away. If you found this journey into the Falklands conflict eye-opening, make sure to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe to World's Echoes for more deep explorations into the mysteries and hidden battles of our world. Until next time, keep listening, because the echoes of history are always around us, waiting to be heard.